They called her Coffee Girl and laughed when she said she knew helicopters. Captain Rodriguez rolled his eyes and muttered, "Sure you do, sweetheart. Stick to the lattes." But when that Apache came screaming out of the storm with smoke pouring from its starboard engine and the tower declared it unflyable, she walked past every pilot on Crimson Ridge Air Base, climbed into the co-pilot seat, and did something nobody thought was possible. She landed a burning war machine with one engine while seasoned combat veterans watched in stunned silence. Because the woman they'd dismissed as just another civilian contractor wasn't who they thought she was. Want to know what happened when they realized the person serving their coffee had more flight hours than their entire squadron combined? Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist still clung to the tarmac at Crimson Ridge Air Base like a gray blanket that refused to be shaken off. Dawn was breaking slowly over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and pink that would soon give way to another scorching day. The base sat in a valley surrounded by rust-colored mountains that looked like ancient sentinels, keeping watch over the military installation below. Row upon row of aircraft dotted the expansive runway, F-16 Fighting Falcons with their sleek profiles, massive C-130 transport planes built for endurance rather than beauty, and the menacing silhouettes of Apache attack helicopters that seemed to crouch on the asphalt like metallic predators waiting to strike. The air hung thick with the familiar cocktail of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and desert dust that every military aviator knew by heart. It was the smell of power, precision, and the constant dance between man and machine that played out on airfields around the world every single day. Somewhere in the distance, a maintenance crew was already at work, their voices carrying across the empty spaces between hangars as they prepared aircraft for another day of training missions, combat readiness drills, and the endless cycle of preparation that kept America's aerial warfare capabilities sharp. But this morning felt different. There was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching thunderstorm building on the horizon. Dark clouds were massing beyond the mountain peaks, promising the kind of violent desert weather that could ground entire squadrons and turn routine operations into life-or-death situations. The meteorology report had warned of severe turbulence, wind shear conditions that could flip aircraft like toys, and lightning strikes that posed deadly risks to anything with wings or rotors foolish enough to venture into the storm's path. In the Base Operations Center, flight controllers monitored radar screens that showed the weather system approaching like a slow-motion avalanche of atmospheric chaos. Emergency protocols were being reviewed, backup plans activated, and contingency procedures put into motion. Every pilot on Crimson Ridge knew that when Mother Nature decided to flex her muscles in the Nevada desert, even the most advanced military aircraft became vulnerable. Respect for the weather was what separated veteran aviators from statistics. In the accident reports, the commissary building near the flight line was already bustling with activity as the day shift began filtering in for their morning caffeine fix. Inside, the familiar routine of military breakfast service was underway. Scrambled eggs that had been prepared in industrial quantities, bacon that snapped with the perfect amount of crispness, toast that emerged from conveyor belt toasters in perfectly timed intervals, and coffee that flowed like liquid motivation into ceramic mugs bearing the insignia of various squadrons and units stationed at the base. Behind the serving counter, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had mastered the choreography of feeding hungry pilots and ground crew, was a woman most people barely noticed. Average height, brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the standard issue uniform of civilian food service contractors. White polo shirt with the Meridian Catering Services logo, khaki pants, and non-slip shoes that could handle the perpetual spillage that came with serving coffee to people. whose hands might still be shaking from high-G maneuvers or pre-flight adrenaline. Her name was Elena Vasquez, though most people at Crimson Ridge simply called her Coffee Girl when they bothered to call her anything at all. To the pilots grabbing their morning fuel before heading out to the flight line, she was part of the background scenery, as invisible and unremarkable as the vending machines humming in the corner, or the motivational posters on the walls urging constant vigilance and mission readiness. She served their coffee with a polite smile, restocked the cream and sugar dispensers when they ran low, and wiped down tables without complaint when aviators left behind newspapers sticky with syrup or napkins bearing the grease stains of hastily consumed breakfast sandwiches. But Elena moved through the commissary with a particular kind of awareness that most people didn't possess. Her eyes tracked the weather display monitors mounted on the walls with the intensity of someone reading critical intelligence reports. When pilots discussed flight plans or weather conditions while waiting in line, she listened with the focused attention of a student absorbing lessons from master instructors. Her gaze would drift toward the windows that faced the flight line, watching aircraft taxi, take off, and land with the kind of analytical observation that went far beyond casual interest. The truth was that Elena Vasquez saw things others missed because she understood things others didn't. When she watched an Apache helicopter performing auto-rotation practice, she wasn't just seeing a military aircraft going through prescribed maneuvers. She was evaluating rotor disc loading, assessing the pilot's entry speed and flare timing, mentally calculating the variables that separated a successful emergency landing from a catastrophic crash. When storm clouds gathered on the horizon, she wasn't just observing weather, she was reading atmospheric conditions, wind gradients, and visibility factors with the instinctive precision of someone who had learned to interpret nature's aerial battlefield through hard-earned experience. But at Crimson Ridge Air Base, she was just the coffee girl, invisible and underestimated, serving caffeine to warriors who had no idea they were being observed by someone whose understanding of flight exceeded their own. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The clock on the commissary wall read 0645 hours, when the first wave of pilots began filtering in for their pre-flight briefings. Crimson Ridge Air Base operated on a schedule as precise as Swiss clockwork, every movement choreographed by decades of military tradition and the unforgiving demands of aerial combat training. The base sprawled across 12,000 acres of Nevada desert, its runways oriented to catch the prevailing winds that swept down from the Sierra Nevada mountains to the west. This wasn't just any military installation. Crimson Ridge specialized in advanced rotorcraft operations, home to the 447th Attack Helicopter Battalion and the elite Desert Storm Training Squadron. The facility had been carved out of the high desert specifically because the terrain mimicked combat zones where Apache helicopters would eventually deploy rocky outcroppings that provided natural obstacles for low-level flight training, wide valleys perfect for formation flying, and weather patterns unpredictable enough to keep even veteran pilots on their toes. The main hangars stretched along the flight line like massive steel cathedrals, each one capable of housing a dozen Apache attack helicopters. Inside these climate-controlled spaces, maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the multi-million-dollar aircraft in peak condition. Every bolt, wire, and hydraulic line was inspected with religious devotion because in the unforgiving world of military aviation, mechanical failure wasn't just an inconvenience, it was often a death sentence. Beyond the hangars, the base operations building rose 3 stories above the desert floor, its windows tinted dark against the harsh Nevada sun. This was the nerve center where flight controllers monitored every aircraft within a 100-mile radius, where weather officers tracked atmospheric conditions with the intensity of ancient priests reading omens, and where squadron commanders made split-second decisions that could mean the difference. Between mission success and catastrophic failure, the commissary sat at the intersection of the main thoroughfare and Flightline Avenue, strategically positioned so that pilots, mechanics, and support personnel could grab quick meals between shifts. Its floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the runway where helicopters took off and landed in an endless ballet of military precision. The interior was functional rather than comfortable. Institutional chairs that could withstand abuse, tables bolted to the floor to prevent theft, and a serving line designed for efficiency rather than ambience. But it was the perfect observation post for someone who understood what they were watching. From the commissary's main dining area, you could see the approach patterns that incoming helicopters followed. Observe the subtle differences in how various pilots handled their aircraft, and read the body language of ground crews, whose movements revealed everything about the urgency of different missions. The weather station's digital displays mounted throughout the building showed what every aviator dreaded: a massive storm system approaching from the southwest, packing winds that would soon exceed safe flying limits. The automated voice of the base weather service echoed through overhead speakers every 15 minutes, updating conditions with the monotone precision of a computer that didn't understand the human consequences of the data it was reporting. Current conditions at Crimson Ridge: wind southwest at 80 knots, gusting to 28, visibility 7 miles in haze. Temperature 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure 29.85 inches and falling rapidly. Thunderstorm. Watch remains in effect until 1800 hours. All aircraft commanders are advised that conditions may deteriorate rapidly without warning. Outside, the desert landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the geometric patterns of runways, taxiways, and the neat rows of aircraft that represented hundreds of millions of dollars in American air power. The mountains on the horizon shimmered in the morning heat, their peaks already obscured by the advancing storm clouds that promised to turn a routine training day into something far more challenging. This was the world where Elena Vasquez spent her days, surrounded by the constant symphony of jet engines, rotor blades, and radio chatter, serving coffee to warriors who lived their lives balanced on the knife's edge between controlled violence and sudden death. It was a masculine environment where respect was earned through demonstrated competence and where assumptions about capability could have fatal consequences. The base operated under its own social hierarchy, as rigid and clearly defined as any medieval court. At the top were the senior pilots, men and women with thousands of flight hours and combat experience that showed in their confident movements and the way junior personnel stepped aside when they walked through the corridors. Below them were the younger aviators, hungry to prove themselves and eager to absorb every lesson that might keep them alive in future combat zones. Ground crews occupied their own respected tier: the mechanics, armorers, and technicians whose expertise kept multi-million-dollar aircraft functioning in conditions that would destroy civilian vehicles within hours. They moved with the confident precision of people who understood that lives depended on their attention to detail. Every tool in its proper place, every procedure followed exactly as prescribed. And then there were the support personnel, the administrative staff, security forces, and civilian contractors who kept the base functioning but rarely touched the aircraft that were the installation's reason for existence. They were essential but invisible, part of the complex ecosystem that enabled combat operations, but rarely acknowledged by the pilots, whose lives they supported. In this carefully ordered world, Elena Vasquez occupied the lowest rung of visibility. She was civilian support staff, contracted through a 30 company, with no military rank or official standing. To most of the personnel at Crimson Ridge, she was simply part of the background infrastructure, as unremarkable as the vending machines or the automated announcement system that regulated their daily routines. But backgrounds could be deceiving. And in the world of military aviation, assumptions about capability could prove dangerous in ways that went far beyond hurt feelings or wounded pride. Elena Vasquez moved through the commissary with the fluid efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of being simultaneously present and invisible. At 34, she possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that allowed her to blend seamlessly into any crowd, medium height, athletic build disguised beneath loose-fitting work clothes, dark brown hair that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail that never seemed to come undone despite the constant motion of her job. Her hands were small but remarkably steady, capable of balancing multiple coffee cups while navigating between tables without spilling a single drop. It was her eyes that set her apart, though most people never looked closely enough to notice. They were dark brown, almost black, and moved with a restless intelligence that seemed to catalog and analyze everything within her field of vision. When she wiped down tables, those eyes were simultaneously tracking the weather displays mounted on the commissary walls, noting wind direction changes and barometric pressure drops with the focused attention of a meteorologist. When she refilled coffee dispensers, she listened to pilot conversations with the concentrated focus of someone translating a foreign language into something she understood better than the speakers themselves. Elena had been working at Crimson Ridge for 18 months, arriving as part of a routine contract renewal between the base and Meridian Catering Services. Her application had been unremarkable, previous food service experience at various locations, clean background check, references that described her as reliable and professional. Nothing in her personnel file suggested anything beyond basic civilian employment history. She had listed her previous job as a server at a truck stop diner in Bakersfield, California, before that a brief stint at a hotel restaurant in Phoenix. Standard transient employment for someone in the food service industry. What the file didn't mention was how she could identify aircraft by the sound of their engines while they were still miles away, or why she always seemed to know when weather conditions were about to deteriorate before the official meteorological reports were updated. It didn't explain why her movements around the commissary followed patterns that kept her positioned near windows facing the flight line during peak operational hours, or why she volunteered for every shift that coincided with complex training exercises. The truth was that Elena Vasquez carried herself with the unconscious posture of someone who had spent years strapped into pilot seats, her spine naturally straight, her shoulders squared in a way that spoke of countless hours fighting G-forces and maintaining situational awareness while controlling aircraft that wanted to kill careless operators. When she walked, there was a subtle economy of movement that suggested someone accustomed to working in confined spaces, where every gesture had to be precise and purposeful. Her hands told their own story to anyone who knew how to read the subtle signs. The calluses on her palms were positioned exactly where they would be from gripping cyclic controls during long flights. A faint scar on her left thumb bore the distinctive mark of someone who had once gotten too close to a rotating helicopter blade, not close enough for serious injury, but near enough to learn the kind of respect for rotor aircraft that could only be earned through experience. Her fingers moved with the unconscious precision of someone who had spent countless hours manipulating delicate flight controls where the difference between life and death could be measured in millimeters. But perhaps most telling was the way she reacted to sudden noises. When jet engines fired up unexpectedly, or when heavy equipment dropped something in the kitchen area, Elena's response was never startled civilian surprise. Instead, she would freeze for just a fraction of a second, her head tilting slightly, as she automatically cataloged the sound's direction, distance, and potential threat level before returning to whatever task occupied her attention. It was the instinctive response of someone who had learned to process auditory information as survival data. During her breaks, Elena would often step outside onto the commissary's small patio area, ostensibly to enjoy the fresh air, but actually to observe flight operations with the intensity of a critic reviewing a performance. She watched helicopters perform auto-rotation procedures and could instantly identify pilots who were cutting corners on safety protocols. When she observed formation flying exercises, her eyes tracked the precise spacing between aircraft with the analytical focus of someone evaluating professional competency rather than casual entertainment. The other civilian employees at the commissary had learned to accept Elena's quirks without question. She always volunteered to work during severe weather when flight operations became more challenging and interesting. She seemed to have an uncanny ability to predict when emergency vehicles would be dispatched to the flight line, often preparing additional coffee and food before anyone officially announced that rescue crews were being activated. Her co-workers attributed this to good instincts and careful attention to radio chatter, never suspecting that Elena was reading flight conditions and operational patterns with the expertise of someone who had once lived in that world. When military personnel engaged her in conversation, Elena displayed a working knowledge of aviation that seemed surprisingly comprehensive for someone whose official job involved serving food. She could discuss weather patterns, aircraft specifications, and flight procedures with casual familiarity, though she was careful never to demonstrate expertise that would raise uncomfortable questions about her background. To the pilots who bothered to notice, she seemed like an aviation enthusiast who had picked up knowledge through proximity and casual interest, but there were moments when her carefully maintained facade would slip slightly when she overheard pilots discussing emergency procedures. Her expression would shift from polite attention to the focused intensity of someone evaluating life or death decision-making processes. When weather conditions deteriorated rapidly, she would position herself near radio equipment with the subtle urgency of someone who understood that deteriorating conditions meant elevated risk for aircraft already in the air. Elena Vasquez had learned to live with the constant tension between who she had been and who she appeared to be now. Every day brought the challenge of maintaining her unremarkable civilian identity while surrounded by reminders of a previous life that felt simultaneously distant and immediately present. She served coffee to pilots whose skills she could evaluate professional accuracy, listened to briefings for missions she could have planned herself, and watched aircraft operations she understood better than most of the people participating in them. The weight of that hidden knowledge was something she carried like a physical burden, invisible to everyone around her, but constant in its presence. She had chosen this anonymity deliberately, seeking the kind of invisible peace that came with being overlooked and underestimated. But hiding in plain sight required constant vigilance, and Elena Vasquez had learned that maintaining a secret identity was almost as demanding as any mission she had ever flown. Captain Jake Rodriguez swaggered into the commissary like he owned the place, flight suit unzipped just enough to reveal the collection of unit patches that decorated his chest like medals of honor. At 28, he carried himself with the particular brand of confidence that came from being naturally gifted at something dangerous and knowing that everyone around him was aware of it. His sandy blonde hair was perfectly regulation length, but styled with just enough gel to suggest he cared about his appearance, and his aviator sunglasses hung from a cord around his neck, even though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. Behind him followed his usual entourage: Lieutenant Tommy Brennan and Captain Mike Diesel Patterson, both younger pilots who had learned that staying in Rodriguez's orbit was the fastest way to advance their own careers. At Crimson Ridge, they moved through the commissary like a pack of predators who had never encountered anything they couldn't dominate through superior skill, attitude, or sheer force of personality. Rodriguez had accumulated over 800 flight hours in Apache helicopters, making him one of the more experienced pilots in the 447th Attack Helicopter Battalion. His record was impressive by any objective measure: expert ratings in weapons systems, advanced certifications in night vision operations, and a reputation for aggressive flying that pushed aircraft to their performance limits without quite crossing the line into recklessness. He was the kind of pilot that instructors pointed to as an example of natural ability combined with technical proficiency. But success had bred in Rodriguez a casual arrogance that colored every interaction he had with people he deemed beneath his professional status. To him, the world was divided into two categories, pilots and everyone else. Within the pilot category, there were further subdivisions based on flight hours, aircraft type, and combat experience. Everyone else, mechanics, support staff, administrative personnel, and especially civilian contractors, existed primarily to make his life easier and his job possible. "Coffee girl," Rodriguez called out as he approached the serving counter, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate attention. "The usual, and make it strong. We've got some real flying to do today. Not like the tourist flights these weekend warriors usually take up." Alina looked up from the industrial coffee machine she was cleaning, her expression remaining professionally neutral. "Regular black coffee, Captain." "That's right, sweetheart," Rodriguez replied, leaning against the counter with practiced casualness. "And make sure it's fresh. Last time I think you gave me something that had been sitting around since the Carter administration." Lieutenant Brennan snickered appreciatively at his captain's wit, adding his own contribution to the morning's entertainment. "Maybe she should start a frequent flyer program. Buy 10 coffees, get a free lesson on which end of the helicopter goes forward." The comment drew genuine laughter from Patterson, who was still young enough to believe that proximity to Rodriguez's confidence might somehow transfer to his own flying abilities. "Careful, Tommy. She might think we're serious and start asking about collective controls and cyclic inputs." Rodriguez accepted his coffee cup with the casual dismissiveness of nobility receiving tribute from peasants. "Right, like coffee girl. Here knows the difference between a rotor disc and a dinner plate." He took a theatrical sip and made an exaggerated face of consideration. "Actually, this isn't terrible. Maybe you missed your calling. You could have been a flight line mechanic instead of food service." The three pilots found this hilarious, though Elena noticed that their laughter carried the forced quality of people who were performing amusement, rather than genuinely experiencing it. They were establishing social hierarchy through mockery, using her as a convenient target to reinforce their own sense of professional superiority. "Speaking of flying," Rodriguez continued, settling into what was clearly a favorite topic of conversation, "we're taking the new Apache variant up for high-altitude maneuvers today. Real pilot stuff, not the basic training exercises they usually run around here." Patterson nodded eagerly, clearly hoping to be included in whatever demonstration Rodriguez was planning. "The AH-64E model, right? The one with the upgraded transmission and enhanced survivability features?" "That's the one," Rodriguez confirmed, his chest visibly swelling with pride. "Most pilots aren't cleared for that level of aircraft. Takes a special kind of skill set to handle that much power and complexity." Elena continued her methodical cleaning of the coffee equipment, but Rodriguez's casual mention of the Apache variant had caught her attention in ways the pilots couldn't have suspected. The AH-64E Guardian was indeed a sophisticated piece of machinery, incorporating technological advances that made it significantly more capable than earlier Apache models. But it was also more complex, with flight characteristics that could surprise pilots accustomed to the more forgiving handling of training aircraft. "You know what the real difference is between military pilots and civilian aviation?" Rodriguez asked, directing the question toward Elena with the air of someone about to deliver a profound lecture. "Civilian pilots follow rules because they're afraid of consequences. Military pilots understand that rules are just suggestions when the mission demands excellence." Brennan nodded sagely, as if Rodriguez had just revealed fundamental truths about the nature of flight itself. "Exactly. Like when we were running those low-level navigation exercises last month. Staying strictly within prescribed altitude parameters would have compromised the training value." Elena's expression remained carefully neutral but anyone with genuine aviation expertise would have recognized Brennan's comment as describing exactly the kind of dangerous corner cutting that killed experienced pilots who confused recklessness with skill. Low-level navigation exercises had specific altitude parameters for reasons that went far beyond bureaucratic rulemaking. They were calculated safety margins that accounted for terrain obstacles, aircraft performance limitations, and human reaction times. The thing about helicopter flying, Rodriguez continued, warming to his subject and clearly enjoying having an audience, is that it separates the real aviators from the pretenders pretty quickly. You can't fake your way through rotorcraft operations like you might with fixed-wing aircraft. Either you have the instincts or you don't. Patterson seized the opportunity to demonstrate his own theoretical knowledge. Right, because of the inherent instability of rotorcraft. Helicopters want to shake themselves apart or flip upside down if you don't maintain constant control inputs. Rodriguez smiled approvingly at his protégé's recitation of textbook knowledge. Exactly. Which is why when civilians talk about understanding helicopters, it's just amusing. Like Coffee Girl here claiming she knows about aviation because she serves pilots all day. Elena set down the cleaning cloth she had been using and looked directly at Rodriguez for the first time since the conversation began. I never claimed to know about aviation, Captain. Smart girl, Rodriguez replied with patronizing approval. Knowing your limitations is the first step toward wisdom. Stick to what you're good at, making coffee and staying out of the way when real professionals are working. The dismissal was complete and devastating, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never considered that the person he was addressing might possess knowledge that exceeded his own. Rodriguez had established himself as the dominant personality in the interaction, reinforced his social position relative to civilian support staff, and entertained his followers with a display of superior attitude. But Elena Vasquez had heard similar displays of false confidence before, and she recognized the subtle signs that distinguished genuine expertise from performed competence. Rodriguez might be a skilled pilot by conventional measures, but his casual dismissal of safety protocols and his need to establish dominance through mockery suggested someone whose abilities might not match his self-assessment. The approaching storm would provide an opportunity for more accurate evaluation. The conversation might have ended there, with Rodriguez and his crew moving on to their morning briefing, satisfied with their casual demonstration of superiority over the civilian staff. But Elena made a mistake, one that would shatter the careful invisibility she had maintained for 18 months at Crimson Ridge Air Base. As the three pilots prepared to leave, Rodriguez casually mentioned their planned training exercise with the new Apache variant. We're going to push that bird to its limits today. High-altitude maneuvers, aggressive auto-rotation entries, maybe some inverted flight if the weather holds. Elena's head snapped up before she could stop herself, her professional instincts overriding her careful civilian persona. Inverted flight in an Apache? The question escaped before she could catch it, her tone carrying the incredulous disbelief of someone who understood exactly why that was impossible. The three pilots stopped mid-stride, turning back toward the serving counter with expressions that ranged from amused surprise to outright mockery. Rodriguez recovered first, a slow grin spreading across his face as he realized the coffee girl had just provided them with unexpected entertainment. "Excuse me," Rodriguez said, his voice taking on the exaggerated patience of an adult addressing a confused child. "Did you just question my flight planning?" Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized the magnitude of her error. She had broken character, allowed her expertise to show through the carefully maintained facade of ignorant civilian contractor. But it was too late to retreat now. The words had been spoken, and Rodriguez was clearly not going to let the moment pass. "I just meant ... Elena began, trying to find a way to walk back her reaction without sounding completely ignorant. "I Thought helicopters couldn't fly upside down. Brennan burst out laughing, slapping his knee with theatrical appreciation. Oh my God, she actually thinks she knows something about helicopter limitations. This is priceless. Let me educate you, sweetheart, Rodriguez said, leaning against the counter with the condescending authority of a professor addressing a particularly slow student. Modern attack helicopters are capable of maneuvers that would surprise you. We're not talking about your grandfather's civilian aircraft here. These are military machines designed for combat operations. Elena bit her tongue, fighting the urge to explain that Apache helicopters were absolutely incapable of sustained inverted flight, that their rotor systems and engine designs made such maneuvers not just dangerous, but mechanically impossible. The A-64's rigid rotor head and semi-rigid rotor system would fail catastrophically if subjected to the stresses of inverted flight. Any pilot who attempted such a maneuver would be committing suicide, but she couldn't say any of that without revealing knowledge that would raise uncomfortable questions about her background. I'm sure you know better than I do, Elena replied carefully, hoping to end the conversation before it escalated further. Rodriguez wasn't finished with his impromptu aviation lecture. The thing is, coffee girl, there's a big difference between reading about helicopters in magazines and actually flying them. Real pilots understand that aircraft capabilities extend far beyond what civilian manuals might tell you. Patterson joined the conversation with eager enthusiasm, clearly seeing an opportunity to demonstrate his own theoretical knowledge. Exactly. Like negative G maneuvers, civilians think they're impossible in rotorcraft. But that's because they don't understand advanced flight dynamics. Elena's jaw clenched involuntarily. Negative G maneuvers in helicopters weren't just inadvisable, they were potentially fatal. Helicopter rotor systems were designed to operate under positive G loads, where centrifugal force kept rotor blades properly positioned. Negative G conditions could cause rotor blades to flex upward into the rotor disc, resulting in catastrophic mechanical failure and immediate loss of aircraft control. That sounds challenging, Elena managed, her voice tight with the effort of not correcting dangerously incorrect information. Challenging for amateurs, Rodriguez replied dismissively. But when you're dealing with elite military aviators, the rules change. We operate at performance levels that civilian aviation never approaches. Brennan nodded sagely, adding his own contribution to the growing pile of dangerous misinformation. Right, like that time we practiced emergency auto-rotations from 8,000 feet. Civilian pilots would never attempt that kind of aggressive energy management. Elena's hands gripped the edge of the serving counter hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Emergency auto-rotations from 8,000 feet weren't aggressive energy management. They were basic flight training exercises that every helicopter pilot learned during initial certification. The altitude actually made the maneuvers safer by providing more time and options for recovery if something went wrong. You must be very skilled pilots, Elena said through gritted teeth, each word carefully measured to avoid revealing her growing frustration with their combination of arrogance and ignorance. We are, Rodriguez confirmed with casual confidence. Which is why when civilians try to discuss helicopter operations with us, it's honestly kind of cute. Like watching a child explain quantum physics after reading a comic book. The metaphor stung because it was so perfectly wrong. Elena had more flight hours in rotorcraft than all three pilots combined, had flown in combat conditions they had never experienced, and had survived emergency situations that would have killed less experienced aviators. She was listening to children explain elementary concepts while claiming expert knowledge they clearly didn't possess. I'm sure you've seen things I could never imagine, Elena replied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Damn right we have, Patterson added, warming to the subject of his own professional superiority. Like last month when we had to deal with severe turbulence during a night training exercise. Civilian pilots would have grounded their aircraft. But we pushed through conditions that would terrify amateur aviators. Elena knew exactly what training exercise Patterson was referring to. She had watched it from the commissary windows and observed violations of multiple safety protocols that should have resulted in immediate grounding of the aircraft involved. The severe turbulence had been moderate wind conditions well within normal operational parameters for experienced pilots. That must have been frightening, Elena said, though she was beginning to suspect that these three pilots represented a dangerous combination of modest skills and unlimited confidence. Fear is what separates professionals from amateurs, Rodriguez declared, apparently unaware that his statement made no logical sense. Real pilots learn to push past fear and operate in conditions that would paralyze lesser aviators. Elena nodded politely while mentally cataloging the growing list of safety violations and questionable judgment calls she was hearing described as professional expertise. These pilots weren't just arrogant, they were dangerous, the kind of aviators who confused recklessness with skill and used false bravado to mask fundamental gaps in their understanding of aircraft limitations. "Well," Elena said finally, "I'm sure you'll have a successful training mission today." Rodriguez straightened up, apparently satisfied that he had sufficiently established his superiority over the civilian contractor who had dared to question his flight planning. "Count on it. And maybe next time, stick to discussing things you actually understand, like coffee temperatures and menu planning." The three pilots walked away laughing, leaving Elena alone behind the serving counter with her hands shaking from the effort of maintaining her composure. She had just listened to 30 minutes of dangerous misinformation delivered with absolute confidence by pilots who would soon be operating multi-million-dollar aircraft in deteriorating weather conditions that the approaching storm was going to test. More than just aircraft performance, it was going to reveal the difference between genuine expertise and performed competence in ways that could prove deadly for everyone involved. Word of Elena's apparent attempt to question Captain Rodriguez's aviation expertise spread through the commissary like wildfire. Within an hour, half the base seemed to know that the coffee girl had tried to lecture a certified Apache pilot about helicopter capabilities. Each retelling embellished the story further, transforming Elena's single incredulous question into an elaborate display of civilian ignorance attempting to challenge military professionalism. By 0800 hours, when the breakfast rush was in full swing, Elena found herself the unwitting star of Crimson Ridge's morning entertainment. Pilots who had never bothered to learn her name were now making special trips to the commissary just to witness the woman who thought she knew better than trained aviators. The morning briefing had apparently been delayed while Rodriguez regaled his squadron mates with the story of how their food service contractor had attempted to correct his flight planning. Chief Warrant Officer Danny Wrench Martinez was the first to arrive with the broader audience, leading a group of maintenance personnel who had heard about the incident through the base's informal communication network. Martinez had 23 years of military service, most of it spent keeping helicopters airworthy, and he carried himself with the weathered confidence of someone who had seen every possible way aircraft could break, fail, or kill careless operators. "So you're the famous coffee girl," Martinez said, his voice carrying the amused tolerance of a veteran dealing with civilian eccentricity. "Heard you've got some strong opinions about helicopter operations." Elena looked up from restocking napkin dispensers, her stomach sinking as she realized the morning's incident had taken on a life of its own. "I really don't know anything about helicopters, Chief." "That's not what Rodriguez says," Martinez replied, clearly enjoying himself. "According to him, you tried to explain Apache flight limitations like you were some kind of expert. Got any other insights about rotorcraft maintenance while we're here?" A small crowd had gathered around the serving counter, drawn by the prospect of watching a civilian contractor get gently humiliated by military professionals. Elena recognized several faces from her months of serving coffee: pilots, mechanics, and support staff who had never paid her any attention before. but were now eager to witness her public education in the realities of military aviation. Staff Sergeant Lisa Chun, one of the base's senior avionics technicians, decided to join the impromptu lesson. Maybe she's been watching too many movies. You know how Hollywood always shows helicopters doing impossible maneuvers that would kill everyone in real life. That's probably it, agreed First Lieutenant Kevin Walsh, a young pilot who was clearly eager to demonstrate his solidarity with Rodriguez's perspective. Civilians see Top Gun or some action movie and think they understand combat aviation. Reality is a little more complicated than special effects. Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks as the group's attention focused entirely on her supposed ignorance. These people weren't being malicious. They genuinely believed they were dealing with a well-meaning civilian who had overstepped her knowledge boundaries. But their patronizing kindness was somehow worse than Rodriguez's open mockery. "Tell you what," Martinez said with the air of someone offering a generous educational opportunity. "Why don't you explain to us what you think helicopters can't do? Might help clear up some misconceptions." The question was clearly intended as entertainment rather than genuine inquiry. Elena could see the barely suppressed grins on faces around the counter, the expectant expressions of people waiting for her to demonstrate her amateur understanding of complex military technology. They wanted her to embarrass herself further by trying to lecture professionals about subjects she supposedly didn't understand. "I really don't know enough to have opinions," Elena replied carefully, hoping to deflect the unwanted attention. "Come on," Walsh pressed, his tone carrying the encouraging patience of a teacher, coaxing participation from a shy student. "Rodriguez said you seemed pretty confident about Apache capabilities. What specifically did you think they couldn't do?" Elena realized she was trapped in a situation where any response would either reveal dangerous knowledge she needed to keep hidden or confirm their assumptions about her ignorance. The crowd was growing larger as word spread that the coffee girl was being given an impromptu aviation lesson by actual military professionals. "I just thought... Elena began hesitantly, then stopped, apparently struggling to articulate her concerns. "Go ahead," Chun encouraged with what seemed like genuine kindness. "We're not going to bite. But it might help if you understand why your concerns weren't technically accurate." Captain Rodriguez chose that moment to make his triumphant return, arriving with several additional squadron members who had apparently come to witness the educational follow-up to his morning's entertainment. He surveyed the scene with obvious satisfaction, clearly pleased that his story had generated such widespread interest. "Still trying to figure out helicopter aerodynamics?" Rodriguez asked Elena with theatrical concern. "Don't worry, it's more complicated than most people realize. Takes years of specialized training to really understand rotorcraft performance parameters." Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Davidson, the squadron's executive officer, had apparently decided to observe the proceedings personally. At 42, she commanded respect through demonstrated competence rather than showmanship, but even she seemed amused by the situation. What exactly prompted this discussion about Apache limitations? Davidson asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity about how a civilian contractor had ended up debating aircraft capabilities with military pilots. Rodriguez was eager to recount his version of events. "She heard me discussing our advanced training mission and questioned whether Apaches could perform certain maneuvers. Seemed to think she knew better than certified military aviators about what our aircraft could handle." Davidson nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Elena with the patient expression of someone prepared to resolve a minor misunderstanding. "The thing is, military aircraft operate under different parameters than civilian helicopters. What might seem impossible for civilian aviation is routine for combat-trained pilots flying purpose-built military machines." Elena felt the walls closing in around her carefully constructed civilian identity. Nearly 30 military personnel were now gathered in the commissary, all focused on educating her about subjects she understood better than most of them combined. The irony was suffocating. She was being lectured about helicopter capabilities by pilots whose understanding of rotorcraft aerodynamics contained fundamental gaps that could prove fatal. "I understand," Elena said quietly, hoping to end the impromptu seminar before it escalated further. "Do you, though?" Rodriguez pressed, clearly enjoying his role as the primary instructor in this public lesson. "Because earlier you seemed pretty convinced that Apaches couldn't handle certain flight profiles. What specifically made you think military rotorcraft were limited in ways that surprised trained pilots?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed he was dealing with amateur ignorance rather than suppressed expertise. Rodriguez had no idea he was demanding that. Elena chose between maintaining her cover and watching him potentially kill himself through overconfidence and dangerous misunderstanding of aircraft limitations. Elena looked around the circle of expectant faces, military professionals who had gathered to witness her education in the realities of combat aviation. None of them suspected that the woman serving their coffee possessed knowledge that exceeded their own, that her apparent ignorance was carefully constructed camouflage hiding expertise they couldn't imagine. "I guess I was wrong," Elena said. Finally, the words feeling like betrayal of everything she had once sworn to protect. Rodriguez smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had finally grasped an important lesson. That's the first step toward real understanding, recognizing when you're out of your depth. But the approaching storm would soon test who was truly out of their depth, and Elena Vasquez knew that the price of false confidence in aviation was always paid in blood. The crowd began to disperse, satisfied that the coffee girl had been appropriately educated about the complexities of military aviation. Rodriguez and his crew headed toward the flight line for their pre-mission briefing. Still chuckling about the morning's entertainment, Elena returned to her routine tasks, trying to ignore the lingering glances and whispered comments from personnel who had witnessed her public lesson in helicopter limitations. But Mother Nature had been building her own lesson plan throughout the morning, and she was about to deliver it with the unforgiving precision that separated theoretical knowledge from life or death reality. At 13:47 hours, the base weather station issued an updated advisory that sent ripples of concern through the operations center. The storm system approaching from the southwest had intensified beyond predicted parameters, with wind speeds increasing to dangerous levels and visibility deteriorating rapidly. What had been forecast as a manageable weather system was transforming into something that would challenge even experienced pilots. Flying well-maintained aircraft. Elena was cleaning tables near the commissary's main windows when she heard the distinctive sound that made her blood run cold, the labored whine of helicopter rotors struggling against severe atmospheric conditions. She looked up to see an Apache helicopter approaching the airfield from the wrong direction, its flight path erratic and unstable in ways that suggested either mechanical failure or pilot incapacitation. Through the commissary sound system, the base air traffic control frequency crackled to life with urgent communications that sent personnel throughout the building scrambling for emergency positions. "Mayday, Mayday, Crimson Ridge Tower, this is Apache 77, declaring emergency. We have complete hydraulic failure in the primary flight control system, partial engine failure on engine number 2, and severe turbulence causing loss of aircraft control. Request immediate emergency landing clearance and full crash response." Elena's hands froze on the table she was wiping. The voice belonged to Captain Rodriguez, but the confident swagger was gone, replaced by the tight, controlled panic of a pilot facing the situation beyond his experience level. Through the windows, she could see the Apache helicopter struggling to maintain controlled flight, its nose pitching up and down erratically as Rodriguez fought to compensate for hydraulic system failures he clearly didn't understand. "Apache 77, Crimson Ridge Tower, you are cleared for emergency landing on runway 09. Crash crews are responding. State souls on board and fuel remaining. 2 souls on board, approximately 20 minutes fuel remaining. Rodriguez's voice crackled back, strain evident in every syllable. Tower, we're having difficulty maintaining rotor RPM. Controls are not responding normally. Elena watched the helicopter's approach with growing horror. Rodriguez was attempting to land the damaged aircraft using techniques appropriate for normal flight conditions. But hydraulic failure in an Apache required completely different control inputs and energy management. He was flying the emergency incorrectly, and his lack of understanding was about to kill both occupants of the aircraft. The Apache lurched sideways, its tail rotor struggling to maintain directional control as Rodriguez overcorrected for wind drift. Elena could see that he was pulling too much collective, trying to arrest his descent rate without understanding how hydraulic failure affected control response timing. The helicopter was developing a dangerous sink rate that would result in a catastrophic impact with the runway. Tower, we're losing it. Rodriguez's voice broke through the radio static, panic now completely overwhelming his professional demeanor. Controls are not responding. We're going to crash. Elena watched the aircraft's final approach with the analytical precision of someone who had faced similar emergencies and survived through superior knowledge rather than luck. Rodriguez was making every possible mistake. His airspeed was too low, his descent angle too steep, and his control inputs were creating aerodynamic instabilities that were making the situation worse with every passing second dot in the tower. Flight. Controllers were shouting instructions that Rodriguez either couldn't hear or couldn't process. Emergency vehicles were racing across the tarmac, but they would arrive too late to prevent the crash that was now seconds away from occurring. Elena looked around the commissary at the faces pressed against windows, military personnel watching helplessly as their colleagues prepared to die in a perfectly preventable accident. She thought about the 18 months she had spent serving coffee to people who had just finished publicly humiliating her for questioning the expertise of a pilot who was about to kill himself through ignorance and overconfidence. She thought about the carefully constructed civilian identity she had built to escape the responsibilities and memories of her previous life. She thought about the peace that came with being invisible, underestimated, and free from the life or death decisions that had once defined her existence. Then she thought about Lieutenant Brennan, sitting in the co-pilot seat of that dying helicopter, probably frozen with terror as he watched Rodriguez make mistake after fatal mistake. Brennan was young, arrogant, and patronizing, but he didn't deserve to die because his aircraft commander couldn't handle an emergency that any competent pilot should have been able to manage. Elena Vasquez made her decision in the space between heartbeats. She dropped the cleaning cloth, walked calmly to the commissary's main entrance, and pushed through the glass doors into the chaos of the emergency response. Outside, the sound of the struggling helicopter was deafeningly loud, its damaged engine screaming in protest as Rodriguez continued to fight controls that required finesse rather than force. Elena broke into a run, her legs carrying her across the tarmac with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent years moving through emergency situations. She reached the base operations building as the Apache made its final catastrophic approach, and without hesitation, she pushed through the security doors that led to the control tower. "You need to let me help," Elena announced to the room full of air traffic controllers and emergency personnel who turned to stare at the civilian contractor who had just invaded their secure workspace. "Ma'am, you need to leave immediately," the tower chief replied, his attention divided between Elena's unexpected presence and the disaster unfolding outside his windows. That Elena looked directly at him with an expression that had once commanded respect in similar situations around the world. "That pilot is about to kill himself and his co-pilot because he doesn't understand how to fly a helicopter with hydraulic failure. I can save them, but only if you let me talk to them right now." The tower chief opened his mouth to order Elena's immediate removal from the secure facility, but something in her voice made him hesitate. Outside the tower windows, The Apache helicopter was beginning its final descent, and everyone in the room could see that. Captain Rodriguez was losing the battle to keep his aircraft airborne. Elena stepped toward the radio console with the calm authority of someone who had taken control in similar emergencies many times before. Apache 77, this is emergency ground assistance. You need to immediately reduce collective input and allow your descent rate to increase. Your hydraulic failure means your controls have a 3-second delay. You're overcorrecting and creating pilot-induced oscillations that will kill you. Rodriguez's voice came back over the radio, desperation evident in every word. Who is this? Tower, I need emergency instructions from qualified personnel. Elena keyed the microphone again, her voice carrying the absolute confidence of someone who had survived situations that would have killed lesser pilots. This is someone who has landed damaged Apaches before. Stop fighting the aircraft and listen to my instructions if you want to live. In the helicopter, with the ground rushing up to meet them and his control inputs making the situation worse by the second, Captain Rodriguez faced a choice that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. He could trust his own expertise, which had already failed him, or he could listen to the voice of the coffee girl, whose knowledge of helicopter emergency procedures was about to prove far more comprehensive than anyone at Crimson Ridge Air Base had ever suspected. The control tower erupted into chaos as Elena's calm voice cut through the radio static, delivering precise emergency instructions to a helicopter that was seconds away from a catastrophic crash. Tower personnel stood frozen, uncertain whether to forcibly remove the civilian contractor, who had somehow gained access to their secure communications, or to allow her to continue what appeared to be a desperate attempt to save 2 lives. Apache 77, reduce your collective by half and push the cyclic forward slightly. Elena continued, her voice maintaining the steady professionalism that distinguished trained emergency responders from panicked bystanders. Your hydraulic failure means your control inputs are delayed and amplified. You're over-controlling and creating oscillations that will tear the aircraft apart. Through the tower windows, every person in the room could see the Apache helicopter responding to Elena's instructions. The violent pitching motion that had characterized Rodriguez's approach began to stabilize as he reluctantly followed the guidance from the woman he had publicly mocked just hours earlier. "Who the hell is that?" demanded Major William Foster, the base operations officer, who had just burst into the tower after hearing about the emergency. "Get that civilian away from the radio immediately." Tower Chief Master Sergeant Robert Kane held up one hand, his eyes fixed on the struggling helicopter outside. 26 years of air traffic control experience had taught him to recognize when unconventional solutions might be the difference between successful rescue and body recovery. "Sir, she seems to know what she's talking about. The aircraft is responding to her instructions." "I don't care if she's giving good advice," Foster snapped. "She's an unauthorized civilian in a secure facility providing flight guidance without certification or authority. This is a massive security violation." Elena ignored the argument developing behind her, her complete attention focused on the radio and the visual cues she could observe from the helicopter's flight behavior. "Apache 77, you're doing well. Now I need you to enter auto-rotation. Cut power to both engines and let the aircraft descend under rotor auto-rotation. Your damaged hydraulics will actually help you during auto-rotation because the controls will be more responsive." Rodriguez's voice came back over the radio, tight with fear but no longer on the edge of complete panic. "Negative ground assistance. Entering auto-rotation with engine failure will guarantee a crash. I'm keeping power on the good engine." "That engine is going to fail completely in the next 60 seconds, Elena replied with calm certainty. "You can hear the bearing failure in your transmission. Enter auto-rotation now while you still have altitude to manage the descent, or wait 30 seconds and enter it involuntarily at 0 altitude." The argument in the tower escalated as more senior personnel arrived to witness the unprecedented situation of a civilian contractor providing emergency flight guidance to military aircraft. Colonel Patricia Hendricks, the base commander, pushed through the crowd that had gathered around the radio console, her expression shifting from bureaucratic irritation to genuine concern as she observed the scene. "What exactly is happening here?" Hendricks demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate and complete answers. "Ma'am, we have an Apache in emergency status with hydraulic and engine failure," King replied quickly. "The civilian contractor somehow got access to the radio and has been providing flight guidance. The aircraft appears to be responding positively to her instructions." Hendricks turned to study Elena, who was completely focused on the radio, communications, and seemingly oblivious to the growing crowd of senior officers surrounding her position. "Has anyone verified her qualifications to provide flight guidance?" "There's no time for verification," Elena said without turning around, her voice carrying absolute authority despite her civilian contractor status. "That transmission bearing is about to seize completely. If he doesn't enter auto rotation in the next 30 seconds, both engines will fail simultaneously and the aircraft will crash with no possibility of recovery." As if summoned by Elena's prediction, a new voice crackled over the radio, Lieutenant Brennan, speaking for the first time since the emergency began. 7-7 co-pilot to tower. Engine number 1 is showing catastrophic failure indicators. Oil pressure dropping rapidly. Temperature climbing beyond redline parameters. Elena keyed the microphone immediately. "Apache 7-7, you now have no choice. Enter auto rotation immediately. Lower collective to maintain rotor RPM. Adjust. Forward cyclic to maintain 80 knots airspeed. You have approximately 40 seconds to touchdown." Rodriguez's voice returned, no longer questioning Elena's instructions, but following them with the desperate precision of a pilot who had finally realized his survival depended on trusting someone else's expertise. "Entering auto rotation now. Collective lowered, maintaining forward airspeed." Through the tower windows, everyone could see the Apache's descent profile change dramatically as Rodriguez cut power to the failing engines and began the controlled crash that represented their only chance for survival. The helicopter was descending rapidly but under control, its rotors maintaining the auto rotation that would cushion their impact with the runway. Colonel Hendricks moved closer to Elena, studying her with the analytical attention of a senior officer who had just witnessed something that challenged her understanding of the situation. "Ma'am, I need to know who you are and how you acquired the knowledge to provide emergency flight guidance to military rotorcraft." Elena's attention remained fixed on the descending helicopter, her hands moving with unconscious precision to adjust radio frequencies and coordinate with emergency response teams. "Apache 7-7, you're approaching the critical phase. At 50 feet, begin your flare. Pull collective aggressively to arrest descent rate. You'll have one chance to get the timing right." The silence in the tower was absolute as everyone watched the final phase of the emergency landing. Rodriguez had to time his flare perfectly. Too early, and the helicopter would climb briefly before crashing harder. Too late, and the impact would destroy the aircraft and kill both occupants. "Now," Elena commanded over the radio. "Full collective, full aft cyclic. Flare hard." The Apache's nose pitched up dramatically as Rodriguez followed Elena's instructions, trading forward momentum for lift in the desperate gamble that defined every auto-rotation landing. For a moment, the helicopter seemed to hang motionless in the air, balanced between controlled flight and catastrophic impact. Then the aircraft settled onto the runway with a jarring but survivable impact, its landing gear absorbing the force of contact as emergency vehicles raced across the tarmac toward the smoking but intact helicopter. The tower burst into spontaneous applause as Rodriguez and Brennan emerged from the aircraft under their own power. Shaken but uninjured from an emergency that should have killed them both, Elena finally turned away from the radio console, her expression calm and professional as she faced the room full of senior officers who were staring at her, with expressions ranging from amazement to suspicion. "Ma'am," Colonel Hendricks said quietly, "I think we need to have a conversation about your background and qualifications." Elena met the colonel's eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had been expecting this moment for 18 months. "Yes, ma'am. I believe we do." Outside, emergency crews were securing the damaged Apache helicopter, while Rodriguez and Brennan walked away from what should have been a fatal crash. Saved by the expertise of a woman they had spent the morning publicly humiliating for her supposed ignorance of helicopter operations, the questions about Elena Vasquez's true identity were about to begin, and the answers would shatter every assumption that Crimson Ridge Air Base had made about the quiet civilian contractor who served their coffee with unremarkable efficiency. "Colonel," Hendricks led Elena to her private office on the 3rd floor of the base operations building, away from the crowd of personnel who had witnessed the emergency landing. The colonel's aide, Captain Rebecca Torres, followed at a discreet distance, carrying a secure tablet and wearing the expression of someone preparing to document information that would require the highest levels of classification. "Please, have a seat," Hendricks said, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from her desk. The office was spartanly furnished in the military tradition, regulation furniture, official photographs of the chain of command, and a window that provided a clear view of the flight line where emergency crews were still securing the damaged Apache helicopter. Elena sat with the same composed stillness she had maintained throughout the crisis, her hands resting calmly in her lap despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had blown her carefully constructed cover identity in the most public way possible, demonstrating expertise that raised questions she had hoped never to answer. "Before we begin," Hendricks said, settling behind her desk with the measured precision of a senior officer conducting a formal interview, "I want you to understand that what happened in that tower represents one of the most extraordinary displays of emergency aviation expertise I've witnessed in 24 years of military service. You saved 2 lives today using knowledge that very few people possess." Elena nodded slightly but remained silent, recognizing that Hendricks was building toward questions that would require careful answers. "However," the colonel continued, "your possession of that knowledge raises significant security concerns. Civilian contractors don't accidentally develop the expertise to guide emergency helicopter operations. That level of skill represents years of specialized training and extensive flight experience." Hendricks opened a manila folder that contained Elena's personnel file, the carefully constructed documentation that had allowed her to obtain civilian contractor status at Crimson Ridge. "According to your employment records, you're Elena Vasquez, 34 years old, with a background in food service and no aviation experience whatsoever. But the woman I observed in that tower wasn't a food service worker who got lucky. She was a trained professional managing a complex emergency with expertise that exceeded our own qualified personnel." Elena met the colonel's eyes directly, recognizing that the moment for maintaining her civilian facade had passed permanently. "The information in that file is accurate as far as it goes, ma'am, but incomplete," Hendricks observed. "Significantly incomplete, I would assume." Captain Torres activated her secure tablet, preparing to record information that would immediately be classified at levels requiring special authorization to access. Elena noticed the precaution and understood its implications, whatever she revealed in this room would become part of military intelligence databases that existed far above normal personnel records. "Ma'am," Elena said quietly, "before I answer your questions, I need you to understand that I came to Crimson Ridge seeking anonymity. I wasn't hiding from criminal activity or trying to evade legal responsibilities. I was simply trying to live." quietly without the complications that come with my previous professional identity. Hendricks leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from official inquiry to genuine curiosity. What complications would those be? Elena was silent for a long moment, weighing the consequences of revealing information she had hoped to keep buried permanently. But the events in the tower had made continued secrecy impossible, and she owed honest answers to the people whose base had unknowingly provided her refuge. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she began, "but for 12 years I was known professionally as Lieutenant Colonel Elena Vasquez, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers." The silence that followed Elena's revelation was so complete it seemed to absorb sound from the surrounding building. Hendricks and Torres both stared at her with expressions that shifted from surprise to something approaching awe. The 160th SOAR represented the absolute pinnacle of military helicopter operations, an elite unit whose pilots operated in conditions that would terrify conventional aviators. "The Night Stalkers," Hendricks repeated slowly, her voice carrying the respect that military aviators reserved for legends. "That explains a great deal about what we witnessed today." Elena nodded slightly. "I accumulated over 4,000 flight hours in combat zones, primarily flying MH-60 Black Hawks and AH-6 Little Birds in special operations missions throughout Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations that remain classified. I also cross-trained extensively on Apache helicopters during joint operations with conventional attack units." Torres looked up from her tablet, clearly struggling to process the magnitude of what she was recording. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, why did you leave special operations to work food service at a training base?" The question touched on painful territory that Elena had hoped never to revisit, but honesty demanded complete answers. "I left the military after a mission went wrong in ways that weren't my fault, but were ultimately my responsibility as aircraft commander. Good people died because of decisions I made under impossible circumstances. I was cleared of any wrongdoing by the official investigation, but I couldn't continue flying knowing that my judgment might fail again in similar situations." Hendricks understood immediately. Military aviation was filled with competent professionals who had walked away from flying careers after experiencing the kind of traumatic losses that shattered confidence in their own abilities. "You suffered survivor's guilt and voluntary grounded yourself. I convinced myself that I could find peace in anonymity," Elena continued. "Working in food service at military installations allowed me to remain connected to aviation without bearing responsibility for life or death decisions. I thought I could serve coffee to pilots and mechanics without getting emotionally involved in their operations. But today you couldn't maintain that distance," Hendricks observed. Elena's composure cracked slightly, revealing the emotional cost of her decision to break cover. "I listened to Captain Rodriguez making dangerous mistakes that would have killed him and Lieutenant Brennan. I spent 18 months serving coffee to people who had no idea that I understood their jobs better than they did. When I saw that Apache approaching with hydraulic failure, I knew Rodriguez was flying the emergency incorrectly, and I couldn't watch 2 people die to protect my anonymity." Torres stopped typing and looked up with an expression of dawning understanding. "You've been evaluating our flight operations for 18 months. What did you observe?" The question opened territory that Elena had hoped to avoid, but complete honesty required addressing the safety concerns she had been quietly cataloging during her time at Crimson Ridge. "I observed multiple violations of emergency procedures, safety protocols being treated as suggestions rather than requirements, and a general attitude among some pilots that confidence could substitute for competence." Hendricks winced slightly, recognizing the accuracy of Elena's assessment. "Specifically regarding Captain Rodriguez and his crew?" "Rodriguez is a skilled pilot within his comfort zone, but he lacks the emergency training and experience necessary for complex failures," Elena replied diplomatically. He's also developed dangerous habits that work fine during routine operations, but become potentially fatal during crisis situations, such as over-controlling aircraft during emergencies, ignoring established emergency procedures in favor of improvisation, and most critically, refusing to acknowledge the limitations of his own knowledge. Alina paused, then added quietly, "The hydraulic failure emergency he faced today is covered in basic helicopter training. Any competent pilot should have been able to handle it without outside assistance." The implications of Elena's assessment hung in the air like an indictment of the training standards and professional oversight at Crimson Ridge. Colonel Hendricks realized she was facing a situation that went far beyond personnel security concerns. She had discovered that one of the most qualified helicopter pilots in the United States military had been working anonymously at her base for 18 months, observing operational deficiencies that her own staff had failed to identify. "Elena," Hendricks said, using her first name for the first time, "I need to ask you a direct question, and I need a completely honest answer." Elena met her eyes steadily. "Yes, ma'am." "Are you willing to consider returning to active flight status? Because based on what I witnessed today, the United States military needs pilots with your expertise, and Crimson Ridge Air Base specifically needs someone who can identify and correct the training deficiencies you've observed." The question Elena had been dreading had finally been asked directly, forcing her to choose between the peaceful anonymity she had sought and the professional responsibilities she had tried to escape. The news of Elena's true identity spread through Crimson Ridge Air Base with the velocity of an explosion, transforming the quiet civilian contractor into a figure of legend within hours of the emergency landing. By 1800 hours, every pilot, mechanic, and support staff member on the installation knew that the woman they had called Coffee Girl was actually one of the most elite helicopter pilots in United States military history. Captain Rodriguez sat in the base medical facility undergoing mandatory post-crash evaluation, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline of nearly dying in a helicopter emergency he had handled with dangerous incompetence. The flight surgeon had cleared him physically, but Rodriguez was struggling with the psychological reality that his life had been saved by the woman he had spent months dismissing as an ignorant civilian contractor. "Jake, you need to understand what just happened," said Chief Warrant Officer Martinez, who had come to check on Rodriguez after hearing about the emergency landing. "That woman who guided you through the auto rotation isn't just some aviation enthusiast who got lucky. She's Elena Vasquez, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Night Stalkers. She's forgotten more about helicopter emergency procedures than most of us will ever learn." Rodriguez stared at the ceiling tiles, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of his error in judgment. "The Night Stalkers? That's impossible. She serves coffee. I've seen her cleaning tables and restocking napkins for over a year. And during that year, she was watching you fly," Martinez continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering an uncomfortable truth. "She was evaluating your techniques, observing your safety protocols, and apparently cataloging every mistake you've been making without anyone noticing." The door to the medical bay opened, and Lieutenant Brennan entered with the subdued expression of someone who had just survived a life-threatening experience. His face was pale, and his flight suit bore the sweat stains of fear and physical stress from the emergency landing. "Tommy," Rodriguez said, struggling to maintain some semblance of command authority despite the circumstances, "you okay?" Brennan sat heavily in a plastic chair, his movements carrying the exhaustion that followed extreme stress. "Physically, yeah. Mentally, ... I keep thinking about how close we came to dying because I trusted your assessment of the emergency procedures." "What do you mean?" Rodriguez asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Jake, you were flying that emergency completely wrong," Brennan replied with brutal honesty. "Every control input you made was making the situation worse. When that woman, Elena started giving instructions over the radio. It was like listening to someone who actually understood what was happening to our aircraft. Martinez nodded grimly, because she did understand. Elena Vasquez has probably handled more helicopter emergencies than every pilot at Crimson Ridge combined. She's flown combat missions in conditions that would ground our entire squadron. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, the squadron executive officer, whose expression suggested she was dealing with a situation that went far beyond routine post-incident debriefing. "Captain Rodriguez," Davidson said, her voice carrying the formal tone that indicated official business rather than casual conversation. "I need to inform you that your flight status is suspended, pending a comprehensive review of today's emergency procedures and your handling of the aircraft emergency." Rodriguez sat up straighter, the professional implications of Davidson's words cutting through his post-crash emotional fog. "Ma'am, I successfully landed a damaged aircraft with no loss of life. The mission outcome was positive. The mission outcome was successful because civilian contractor Elena Vasquez intervened to correct dangerous errors in your emergency procedures," Davidson replied with clinical precision. "Your initial response to hydraulic failure violated multiple established protocols and would have resulted in aircraft loss and crew fatalities if not for outside intervention." Davidson consulted a tablet containing the preliminary incident report. "Specifically, you failed to properly identify the emergency condition, attempted to maintain powered flight with failing systems instead of entering auto-rotation, and refused to follow established emergency procedures in favor of improvised techniques that were demonstrably ineffective." Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing that his own performance during the emergency was about to come under similar scrutiny. "Ma'am, what about my status as co-pilot?" "Lieutenant Brennan, your flight status is also suspended, pending additional training in emergency procedures and aircraft systems," Davidson continued. "However, your suspension is administrative rather than disciplinary, since you weren't the aircraft commander responsible for emergency decision-making." Martinez cleared his throat, recognizing that someone needed to address the broader implications of the day's events. "Ma'am, if I may ask, what happens to Elena?" "She violated multiple security protocols by accessing the control tower and providing unauthorized flight guidance." Davidson's expression softened slightly, indicating that Elena's situation was being handled through different channels than routine disciplinary action. "Ms. Vasquez is currently meeting with Colonel Hendricks and representatives from higher headquarters. Her actions today saved lives and demonstrated expertise that our command structure needs to evaluate carefully." "Will she face charges for the security violations?" Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested he hoped the answer would be negative. "That determination will be made at levels above my authority," Davidson replied diplomatically. "However, I can tell you that the preliminary assessment focuses on the positive outcome of her intervention rather than the procedural irregularities of how she gained access to radio communications." The room fell silent as the three pilots contemplated the professional consequences of their morning's encounter with Elena Vasquez. Rodriguez was facing suspension and retraining that would effectively reset his career progression. Brennan was confronting the reality that his own aviation knowledge was far less comprehensive than he had believed. And both men were struggling with the psychological impact of discovering that the woman they had publicly mocked possessed qualifications that dwarfed their own. "There's something else you need to understand," Martinez said quietly, his voice carrying the gravity of someone delivering information that would permanently alter their perspective. "Elena could have let you crash. She had been serving coffee to people who treated her like she was invisible for 18 months. She had every reason to stay in the commissary and let you handle your own emergency." "But she didn't," Brennan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, she didn't," Martinez confirmed. "She broke cover, violated her own anonymity, and exposed herself to exactly the kind of attention she had been trying to avoid, all because she couldn't watch two pilots die from preventable mistakes. Rodriguez closed his eyes, finally grasping the full magnitude of Elena's sacrifice. She had given up the peaceful invisibility she had sought in order to save the lives of people who had been openly contemptuous of her supposed ignorance. "Chief," Rodriguez said finally, his voice carrying a humility that had been absent from his earlier interactions. "When you see Elena, will you tell her that Captain Rodriguez requests permission to apologize personally for his conduct?" Martinez studied Rodriguez's face, searching for signs of genuine remorse rather than professional damage control. "I'll pass along the message. But Jake, you need to understand that she's not going to be serving coffee anymore. After today, Elena Vasquez is going to be dealing with people at pay grades that make Colonel look like entry level." Outside the medical facility, the sun was setting over Crimson Ridge Air Base, painting the desert landscape in the deep oranges and purples that marked the end of another day of military aviation training. But this day had been different, marked by an emergency that had revealed truths about competence, humility, and the dangerous consequences of assumptions about expertise based on appearance rather than demonstrated ability. Elena Vasquez would never again be invisible at Crimson Ridge, and the pilots who had learned to respect her expertise through near-fatal experience would carry that lesson for the rest of their careers. 3 weeks later, Elena Vasquez stood in the same commissary where she had once served coffee to pilots who barely acknowledged her existence, but everything had changed in ways that went far beyond her official duties. The morning sun streamed through the familiar windows, illuminating the same tables and chairs where she had once cleaned up after personnel who treated her as part of the invisible infrastructure that kept military operations functioning. But Elena was no longer invisible. She wore the flight suit of an active duty instructor pilot, her lieutenant colonel rank insignia restored after extensive discussions between Crimson Ridge Command and Pentagon officials who had been quietly monitoring the situation since her dramatic revelation 3 weeks earlier. The decision to return Elena to active flight status had been unprecedented. The military rarely allowed personnel to resume careers they had voluntarily abandoned, but her demonstration of expertise during the helicopter emergency had convinced senior leadership that exceptional circumstances warranted exceptional solutions. Her new position as Chief of Flight Safety and Emergency Procedures Training represented a role specifically created to address the operational deficiencies she had observed during her 18 months of enforced anonymity. Elena would be responsible for evaluating pilot competency, redesigning emergency training protocols, and ensuring that the dangerous attitudes she had witnessed would not continue to compromise flight safety at Crimson Ridge. The commissary had then temporarily converted into a briefing room for the mandatory retraining session that Elena was about to conduct for every pilot stationed at the base. The tables had been arranged in classroom formation, facing a projection screen where Elena would present the lessons learned from Rodriguez's near-fatal emergency 3 weeks earlier. Captain Rodriguez entered the room with the subdued bearing of someone whose professional confidence had been permanently recalibrated by harsh reality. His flight status remained suspended, pending successful completion of Elena's retraining program, and his entire career trajectory had been fundamentally altered by his encounter with a helicopter emergency he couldn't handle. But the arrogance that had once characterized his interactions with support personnel had been replaced by something approaching genuine humility. Lieutenant Brennan followed closely behind, his own flight suit bearing the temporary markings of student pilot status. Despite his previous certification as a qualified Apache co-pilot, like Rodriguez, he was facing the professional humiliation of returning to basic training under the supervision of the woman he had once mocked for her supposed ignorance of aviation principles. Other pilots filed into the converted commissary, with expressions ranging from curiosity to resentment. Some were genuinely interested in learning from Elena's expertise, while others struggled with the ego damage of being taught by someone they had previously dismissed as a civilian contractor. The social dynamics of military aviation made it difficult for some personnel to accept instruction from someone who had been serving their coffee. Just weeks earlier, Elena took her position at the front of the room with the same calm professionalism she had demonstrated during the emergency, but now her bearing carried the unmistakable authority of someone whose expertise had been proven under the most demanding circumstances possible. She had saved lives through superior knowledge, and that achievement commanded respect even from those who struggled with their own wounded pride. "Good morning," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the room with the confident projection of someone accustomed to commanding attention in life or death situations. "For those who don't know me personally, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Elena Vasquez, your new Chief of Flight Safety and Emergency Procedures Training. Some of you may remember me from my previous position in food service, where I had the opportunity to observe your flight operations from a unique perspective." A few pilots shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing that Elena's unique perspective had allowed her to catalog safety violations and operational deficiencies that their own command structure had failed to identify. 3 weeks ago, Captain Rodriguez and Lieutenant Brennan experienced a helicopter emergency that should have been manageable for any qualified pilot. Elena continued, her tone remaining neutral and educational rather than accusatory. "The fact that their emergency nearly resulted in fatalities revealed significant gaps in our training procedures and emergency preparedness protocols." Rodriguez looked down at his hands, still processing the reality that his inability to handle basic emergency procedures had required rescue by someone he had publicly ridiculed for questioning his expertise. "But this briefing isn't about assigning blame for past mistakes," Elena said, making eye contact with Rodriguez in a gesture that acknowledged his difficult position without offering false comfort. "It's about ensuring that future emergencies are handled with the competence and professionalism that our mission demands." Elena activated the projection screen, displaying detailed diagrams of helicopter, hydraulic systems and emergency procedures that illustrated the technical knowledge pilots needed to survive equipment failures. Her presentation was comprehensive and professional, drawing on decades of experience in situations that had tested her skills against the unforgiving realities of combat aviation. "The most dangerous attitude in aviation is the belief that confidence can substitute for competence," Elena said, addressing the core issue that had characterized Rodriguez's approach to flying. "Genuine expertise comes from understanding your limitations as clearly as you understand your capabilities." Chief Warrant Officer Martinez, who had observed the transformation of Elena's status from civilian contractor to senior instructor pilot, raised his hand with a question that addressed what everyone in the room was thinking. "Ma'am, during your time in food service, what did you observe about our flight operations that concerned you most?" Elena considered the question carefully, recognizing that her answer would need to balance honesty with diplomacy. "I observed talented pilots who had developed habits that worked fine during routine operations, but could prove fatal during emergencies. I saw safety protocols being treated as suggestions rather than requirements. Most concerning, I witnessed a culture where questioning established procedures was discouraged rather than encouraged." The room fell silent as pilots contemplated Elena's assessment of their professional standards. Some recognized the accuracy of her observations, while others struggled with the implications of being evaluated by someone they had considered beneath their notice. "The good news," Elena continued, "is that these issues are correctable through proper training and attitude adjustment. Everyone in this room has the basic skills necessary to handle complex emergencies. What we need to develop is the judgment and humility to apply those skills correctly when lives depend on making the right decisions." As Elena concluded her presentation and dismissed the pilots for individual training sessions, Rodriguez approached her with the careful demeanor of Someone requesting a conversation he wasn't certain would be granted. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying none of the casual arrogance that had once characterized his interactions with Elena. "I wanted to apologize personally for my conduct during your time in food service. My behavior was unprofessional and disrespectful, and I'm grateful that you were willing to risk your own safety to save my life despite how I treated you." Elena studied Rodriguez's expression, searching for signs of genuine remorse rather than career-motivated damage control. What she saw was a pilot who had been fundamentally changed by confronting the gap between his perceived competence and his actual abilities. "Captain, your apology is accepted," Elena replied with the quiet dignity that had sustained her through months of being underestimated and dismissed. "But the most important thing you can do now is learn from the experience and become the kind of pilot who would never need rescue from preventable emergencies." Rodriguez nodded, understanding that Elena's forgiveness came with expectations for improved performance that would define the rest of his aviation career. As the pilots filed out of the commissary to begin their remedial training, Elena remained behind to restore the room to its normal configuration. She moved the tables back to their original positions, the same tables where she had once cleaned up after personnel who barely acknowledged her existence. But Elena Vasquez was no longer the invisible coffee girl, and she never would be again. She had chosen to reveal herself when lives hung in the balance, sacrificing the peaceful anonymity she had sought in order to prevent a tragedy that would have haunted her forever. The lesson of Crimson Ridge Air Base would ripple outward through military aviation training programs, reminding pilots that expertise could be found in unexpected places, that respect should be given freely until proven undeserved, and that the most dangerous assumption in aviation was believing that appearances revealed everything worth knowing about the people around them. Sometimes the person serving your coffee knows more about flying than you do. The wise pilot learns to listen before they learn to dismiss, because in aviation, humility isn't just a virtue, it's a survival skill. That can mean the difference between coming home safely and becoming a cautionary tale about the deadly consequences of underestimating quiet competence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.